So turning is something that I enjoy teaching. So I get to introduce a lot of people to the lathe. And I think the lathe, more so than any other tool in the shop, can be a little confusing when you're looking at purchasing your first one. Sometimes the specs don't match up with what the price is, and two lathes that look like they are pretty much identical have a vastly different price point. So I want to kind of talk you through what I look for in a lathe and how I determine what lathe is going to suit the type of turning that I do. So on the surface, I think there are three different specs that people look at when they look at lathes. The first being the swing of the lathe. And this is what tells you how big the lathe is. The swing is the distance from this center point of the headstock down to the bed. So something that is classified like the South Bend as an 18-inch swing means that there's 9 inches from the very center down to the bed. So that means that this will turn an 18-inch piece of wood. And that's important to know if you are planning on doing bowls, something like this cherry bowl that I'm working on. The bigger the swing, the bigger piece of wood that you can put in. But I have a caveat with that. I have turned on a lot of 24-inch lathes. And while it's fun to turn that big of bowl, I found that they're not very useful in the house. So while I've turned a few of them and I enjoy doing it, there's something that you kind of have to find a place for in the house, and I just don't think that that is necessarily the size that most people want to turn. So in my mind, something in the 18 to 20 inch range is a much nicer size lathe. As I mentioned, the South Bend is an 18-inch swing. So this bowl here is probably, let's say 14 inches in diameter or so, and this is a great size for a standard utility type bowl, and that's what I like to turn. So don't always think that bigger is better when it comes to the swing. Now the next thing to look at is the length of the bed, okay? The length of the bed is the length of wood that you can fit between the headstock and the tailstock. And on the South Bend, that's 40 inches. That means I can fit a 40-inch piece of wood between a drive spur here and the tailstock here when I remove that quill and move it back to the furthest position. Which that's important if you are looking at doing spindle type work, something like table legs, chair legs, rail banisters, stuff like that. That's not the type of work I do necessarily, so I don't need a huge lathe. You know, you can get lathes with beds 6 foot long, but that's not the type of work I enjoy doing. I'm a bowl turner, so I like a short little bed like this. South Bend, 40 inches is plenty for anything I'm doing. I do occasional chair legs, occasional table legs, but they're never over that 40-inch mark. So that's the second thing I look at. And the third isn't a spec that you necessarily always think about until you need it, and that's the horsepower of the motor. Now, for spindle work, something like a chair leg or a table leg, you can get by with a little bit lower horsepower because you have a smaller diameter piece of wood. Generally, it's more balanced, and you're turning it at a faster RPM. But something like this bowl blank, you know, this thing probably weighs 10 pounds, 12 pounds, and I'm taking big, heavy cuts on it. I mean, looking at these shavings, those are big pieces of wood that are coming off. So I want to make sure that this has the torque and the horsepower in that motor to turn this piece of wood without slowing down. Now, this is extremely important when I flip this bowl around and I start working on the inside, especially if you are making bowls with a coring system where you're taking out the center to get multiple bowls out of one blank. Then you want at least a 2 or a 3 horsepower lathe. So those are the big three on the surface, but there are other specifications that you really want to pay attention to when you are looking at a lathe, and these ones aren't as apparent. So let me walk you through those that I've found are important to me and the features that I use. Now, looking at the controls first. Most lathes are going to be variable speed. Some of them you do have to change belts on to change the speed. So you'll have to step from 1 to 5 different pulleys to change the spindle speed here. But with something like this South Bend that's variable speed, I have a knob that I can speed the lathe up or I can slow it down. And in conjunction with this, I also have a digital readout here that tells me the spindle RPM. And I can increase that just with a turn of the knob up to 303 RPM. Now, some people will argue that that digital readout isn't super necessary, and it's not. You should turn as fast as you are comfortable. If the lathe is walking across the floor, you're probably turning a little bit too fast. But there are certain applications where having the digital readout is really nice. Something like thread chasing, where you want to be at the same speed every time, it is valuable to have. In addition to the electronic variable speed, I also like to have a second set of controls somewhere. I have the main controls on the south bend right down here by my left knee, but having a remote switch somewhere like this guy is also really handy. So if I'm in the middle of a cut and I need to get to the stop button extremely quickly, or if I'm down on the end working on a hollow form, I have a position here to start and stop the lathe versus having to come around to the front of it to shut it off. So having that remote switch is really handy. Some of them are fixed, like the south bend. Some of them are also magnetic, where they stick on the front of the lathe and you can move them around. Tomato, tomato in my mind, as long as you have that second one. Now, another thing that is nice to have, and if something has electronic variable speed, more than likely it's going to have this feature, but that is the ability to reverse the lathe as well. And that doesn't seem like something you would necessarily do all the time, and it's not, but it's super handy when you need it. So a lot of the times when I'm reversing something, it's because I want to sand in reverse. So rather than sanding with the workpiece coming at me in the forward direction, I'll actually flip this in reverse, and I can hold my hand on top and the workpiece spins away from me, which is super handy. There's even some times where I might hollow the inside of like a hollow form with the lathe in reverse. You just gotta make sure whatever you have your workpiece attached to is securely attached to the spindle with grub screws. Now, a couple of other features that are not as common are something like a spindle lock, being able to lock the spindle in place. You like to be able to lock that spindle so you can tighten stuff down on the lathe, and in particular, you can get stuff off of the lathe, because after I've been turning a big bowl like this, the torque really tightens this faceplate down to that spindle. I want to be able to lock the spindle and spin this off by hand. Now, a good quality lathe will also have an indexing system, so that spindle lock will actually index these workpieces at different areas in that 360-degree radius. They might be 36 locations, they might be 12, they might be 48 locations. But what that allows me to do is to clock this workpiece in different locations and lock it in place. And that's useful when you start getting into some higher end turning where you're doing decorations on the outside of a turned piece. So it may be something like this bowl where I want to add carved fluting evenly spaced around the bowl. And I could lock the spindle, draw my line or carve it, and then I could rotate this maybe 10 degrees to the next one and do the same thing. Some of these spindle locks or indexes like this will have a lot of slop in them. This south bend's nice and tight, which is really important when you start getting into that really detailed work where you want those lines perfectly straight and perfectly crisp, because any little bit of vibration there or play will cause those lines to wander a little bit. So having a nice tight indexing system will help you as you start getting into those higher end turnings. It may not be something that you use as you just get started in turning, but down the road it is something that you will come to appreciate. So the other couple things I look at are kind of the extra features. I'm looking at the weight of the lathe, because a lathe, the heavier the lathe is, the more stable it's going to be generally. So something like the south bend is 420 pounds, and that has some good heft to it. You can tackle out of round blanks pretty easily with that. Anything lighter and it starts to walk across the floor as you're trying to turn those big heavy blanks, and it makes it hard to turn and it can be dangerous. So you want a good heavy lathe to handle those out of round blanks, especially if you're getting into something like bowl turning or faceplate turning. The other things I'm looking at are how well does the banjo, the tool rest, and that tailstock lock into place. Because I can't tell you the number of times that I have been turning and I lock the banjo down, lock my tool rest down, and I'm in the middle of a cut and I see those start to slip. And that can be dangerous, because if they turn into the spinning piece, I can get a big catch, I can break a tool rest, I can break a banjo, stuff like that. So something like this, south bend, it locks down. I can almost tip this lathe over off that banjo if I want, and it's not moving anywhere, which is really nice. So then there are a few extra features that not every lathe has, not all of them share this feature, but they are nice. Now, I talked earlier about the swing of the lathe. How big of a piece will it swing above the bed? Some lathes, like the south bend, have a gap in here. This is what we call a gap bed lathe. This actually gives you a little bit of extra clearance right in here if you're turning something like a bigger platter. This one gives you about an extra 2 inches of clearance in here, so you can spin a little bit bigger piece than what you can above the bed. So that's a nice feature. You may not use it all the time, but it's a nice feature when you need it. And the other thing that we talked about earlier is the length of the bed. Now, a lot of these lathes will be available with bed extensions. And if the manufacturer really is thinking about it as they're designing their lathe, their bed extensions can be used on the back side of the bed, like this one over here. What this allows you to do is not only take that bed extension, mount it here and get extra length on your overall spindle length, but it also allows you to turn outboard turning. What I mean by that is this hand wheel here is actually an extra faceplate. So instead of turning on this side of the lathe, I can actually remove this banjo, put it on this bed that's on the headstock side, and I can turn almost 36 inches on the back side of this lathe. So even though this is an 18-inch lathe, which is a medium to bigger size lathe, I can go really big going outboard. So some of these features are really apparent when you start looking at lathes. Some of them may be hidden. But go ahead and take what I've shown you today and what I've talked about with you as you start looking for your own lathe, as you start your turning journey. Now I'm gonna flip this bowl around and keep working.